I'd like to welcome everyone to our conference. Do not adjust your set. I thought I might just say something about why we chose that title. In fact, it's a title that I gave to a paper I wrote about this whole area, but it derives from the 1960s. And at that time, and I don't suppose many of you are old enough to remember this, but if there was something wrong with your television set, like you got wavy lines on it, there was a thing called the vertical hold and the horizontal hold that you could turn in order to correct the fault. But sometimes the fault wasn't with your set, it was with the signal. And quickly the broadcaster would put a notice on that would come up on your TV saying, do not adjust your set. In other words, there's something wrong with the signal. And I think that's the way that we use that to convey the sense that over the last relatively short time, the huge cultural pressure and force to think in a different way about issues to do with gender and sex and sexuality. And I think, as we put in somewhere, I think in the flyer, that a commentator who's followed Parliament for 25 years has pointed out how quickly this has penetrated into culture and into politics with very little interrogation. And also, I'm sure as we're here today, very difficult to engage in discussion without being characterized as being abusive or transphobic. And a lot of people know platforms. A lot of people find themselves isolated suddenly from colleagues and so on. So the idea, do not adjust your set, is to say, even in this very sort of difficult world, to hold on to one's perception of the world and realize that there's something gone very wrong with the signal. I think most panels are referring to children, but we're taking this problem broadly. Of course, children have a kind of priority, particularly in terms of the consequences for children of being quickly misdiagnosed as suffering from gender difficulties as opposed to many other problems that they have. And we'll hear about that later. And that's been much in the public eye recently with the judicial review of the Tavistock, which we'll discuss at the end of the conference, where it was found that children don't have the capacity to consent to medical intervention. And also more recently, the CQC, the Care Quality Commission, issued a report on the Tavistock, which is a national service, which found the service inadequate. And included among these issues were the lack of proper clinical governance and also workers within the service not being able to speak up. But this issue is much broader. It's not just about the Tavistock. The Tavistock becomes a kind of location for a part of this huge social and cultural transformation, which we'll be looking at today from various angles, including obviously the clinical, which I've mentioned, but also from broader sociological, philosophical, and feminist perspectives. I think the whole area to me is like a kind of crystal, as if condensed into it are many of the contradictions of the current social and political world that we live in, and they're sort of refracted and intensified through that crystal. So also investigating this area isn't just investigating this problematic, but also is very useful as a kind of object to interrogate, which reveals underlying pressures and contradictions. My own involvement, as many of you will know, is that I'm a consultant psychiatrist, just actually last week retired from the Tavistock. And I was a member of what's called the Council of Governors. The Council of Governors is a kind of parallel management body of the trust and has oversight, is made up of stakeholders. And I was the clinical and academic staff representative. And in 2018, I was approached by a large number of staff of GIDS, the gender clinic, who had very serious ethical and clinical concerns about the way these children were being mismanaged. And the way that ideological and highly politicized movements have managed to influence the gender, to influence GIDS, so much so that it was very difficult to give any other perspective. But they're also concerned about the loss of a psychotherapeutic and psychoanalytic, something engaging more in a more complex way with the children, of course, and with their families, and rapid decisions being made. And this was part, them coming to me, I then realized later as I linked up with people, part of the sort of growing concern, which then I think as all that is part of the chain of events that led to the judicial review.
Welcome everybody, my name is Dave Pilgrim. I'm going to be chairing this first session. I recently read Heather's most recent book, Transgender Body Politics, which was fascinating. And after that, we should be joined by Julie Bindel. And so the two speakers will go straight after one another, and then we'll have half an hour chat, question and answer. Okay. So on that note, can I very, very warmly welcome Heather to the conference. Thank you, Heather.
On the 20th of January in 2021, the Care Quality Commission, the alleged independent regulator of health and social care in England, published the results of an inspection of the Gender Identity Development Services. This is the only National Health Service provision for children who are concerned about issues of sex and gender. The Commission has rated the GIDS, I will call it now for our international audience, I will call the Gender Identity Development Services, the GIDS. The Commission has rated the GIDS inadequate and highlighted, and I quote, overwhelming caseloads, deficient record keeping, and poor leadership. Paul Jenkins, the chief executive of the Tavistock in which the GID finds itself, that's a National Health Service Foundation Hospital Trust, immediately responded with a public statement. Without referring to the issue of leadership, he nevertheless fulsomely apologized. What did he apologize for? He apologized that the growth in demand at the GIDS has exceeded the capacity of the service. Jenkins described the long waiting lists and inadequate record keeping as falling short in the support of young people and families, particularly in the current climate. He insisted that although the GIDS had been operating successfully for 30 years and deploys a practical evidence-based approach, it had now found itself in the middle of a political and cultural battleground, which had been hugely challenging for the children, the parents, and the clinicians. Mermaids, which is a trans-affirmative UK organisation for children and parents, which campaigns for early and easy access for puberty blockers, immediately responded. We hope the National Health Service see this report as a wake-up call to give the GIDS more resources and give children the care that they need. So, the results, although devastating, were not unexpected for those of us who have researched the GIDS for the previous few years. For example, myself and my colleague, Professor Michelle Moore. But in this presentation, I argue that a major significance of the report is that it doesn't get to the heart of the problem. The problem won't be solved by more money, better organisation and record keeping, or even in the change of leadership. What needs to be addressed is that gender identity development medicine is completely and unequivocally institutionally captured by trans ideology and politics. The National Health Service, Tavistock Hospital Trust, and the Care Quality Commission, to which I've just referred, are both committed to Stonewall's views on the meaning of transgenderism and of trans equality. For example, the Chief Executive Officer of the Care Quality Commission sees no contradiction in claiming both neutrality and at the same time declaring, "We're pleased to have progressed and been named in Stonewall's Top 100 Employer Index. This outcome reflects a sustained program of work around the LGBT agenda by our senior leadership within the Commission." And Stonewall, for those people who are not in British, will probably know, but I'll just confirm that Stonewall is an LGBT charity. So the JID's narrative of moderation in the face of extremism is dangerous, not only for children who find themselves at the JIDs, but for all children. But before I substantiate my claims of institutional capture, I give an example of what the JIDs considers to be steering a middle course in supporting a distressed girl who perceives herself as a boy. At the judicial review of the JIDs in London's High Court in October 2020, the Tavistock's barrister argued that a 10-year-old girl, if she has mental capacity, can give informed consent to puberty blockers. This specific example was raised in the context that 16% of the children referred to by the JIDs for puberty blockers are 13 years or younger. The following evidence was put before the court. 1, most children who have gender dysphoria actually grow out of it. There may be only 10 to 15% whose dysphoria continues throughout childhood beyond puberty. 2, hormone blockers are experimental and have deleterious consequences on the body, such as decrease in bone density and restrictions on growth, and so on. 3, nearly 100% of children taking puberty blockers go on to take cross-sex hormones. 4, there are no longitudinal studies to demonstrate the psychological efficacy of hormone treatment or surgery, such as mastectomy, since the consequences for these young people as adults are virtually unknown. I will leave it to my colleague, Dr. Michael Biggs, to explore later the issue of puberty blockers and the JID's claims for evidence-based practice. What I want to discuss and focus on here is the argument deployed by the barrister to justify referring a 10-year-old for puberty blockers, despite the full awareness of the evidence put before the court. In all other areas of life, for example, buying alcohol, smoking, watching pornography, entering into legally binding contracts, a 10-year-old child is not deemed competent to decide for her or himself the likely consequences and impact of her decision-making. At a stage when, as one of the judges himself said, a child is still squeamish at the mere thought of adult sex, who has had no adult experience of orgasm, who cannot possibly predict the future and whether she will want children, was in all seriousness deemed by the barrister for the JIDs, Tavistock JIDs, as having capacity to consent to life-changing medical procedures. The barristers portrayed this as a social justice issue, and that to refuse the 10-year-old puberty blockers was to deny her agency and bodily autonomy. The question that needs to be answered, therefore, are the following. On what evidential grounds did the Tavistock's barrister argue that a 10-year-old can consent to being put on a medical path to adulthood, which will almost inevitably lead to irreversible impairment of sexual functioning and loss of fertility. Which model of social justice does the Tavistock work within? The answer to this question lies in the development of postmodern psychology, which claims, 1, transgender children and young people are oppressed by transphobia. 2, the idea of seeking the causes of a child's transidentification is to pathologize the child. And 3, knowledge of gender identity development should be developed and led by therapists who themselves have personal experience of non-normative gender identities, or who are at least the trainers of other clinicians who do have normative gender identities. So I've written extensively elsewhere about the politics and theoretical roots of the postmodern psychology applied to children. So I'm not going to rehearse those points here. I don't have the time, but I'm going to briefly flag up some of the following factors. The growth of transactivism in the late 20th century, the development of postmodern theory in the academy at the end of the 20th century, in particular, the work of the queer theorist Judith Butler, the coining of the term transgenderism, indeed, by Stonewall. For example, as far as Stonewall is concerned, transgenderism is an umbrella term which includes transsexual, genderqueer, gender fluid, non-binary, cross-dresser, etc. And Stonewall maintains that anyone who identifies as the other sex must be affirmed as such, and any other view is transphobic and oppressive, in the same way that lesbian and gay people had previously been oppressed. And I'll just remind the listener at this point that this is the organization to which the Care Quality Commission and the Tavistock are proud to be signed up with. But I go on, including the politics of the theoretical roots also belong to a revisionist history that casts LGBT as one homogenous oppressed group. The growth of lobby groups for children, such as gyras, mermaids, and gendered intelligence, and their disproportionate influence as stakeholders on the GIDS. I've written extensively about this. The Memorandum of Understanding on alleged transgender conversion therapy, to which most psychological services and therapists are now bound. So this is the background context in which we're now thinking about the Care Quality Commission result and the result of the judicial review, which was the refusal, in fact, of the idea that children can consent. So we get back to the GIDS. The GIDS was created in 1989, and its ethos at inception leaned towards the rejection of a psychoanalytic or psychological approach to cause. And it was working against that notion because it thought of it at that time, right at the end of a decade before the end of the 20th century, that would be the traditional psychoanalytic approach was repressive of children's non-normative gender identities. Following on from that, we have the growth of the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, sometimes known as WPATH. This was created and developed to provide unequivocally trans-affirmative clinical guidance and continuing professional development courses for health professionals working within gender identity clinics, and the GIDS itself receives its continuing professional development training from WPATH. The theory which emerged from WPATH and the transgender movement then reverses the conventional definitions of sex and gender as these have hitherto been understood by human rights law, by biological science indeed, and by the original therapeutic approach and ethos of the Tavistock. These conventional definitions are, firstly, that born sex, whether one is male or female, is a biological reality, which is empirically observed. Secondly, that gender is a social, cultural phenomenon that refers to social roles and stereotypes, for example, such as expectations about clothes, toys, behaviors, intellectual interests. And gender identity refers to how individuals and groups perceive and present themselves as masculine or feminine. A cursory glance at history demonstrates that masculinity and femininity are performed differently within specific cultures and societies. But in contrast, the specific core beliefs and claims held by WPATH and trans pressure and lobby groups are the following, and these are the ones that the GIDS has taken on. When a baby is born, parents, medical attendants do not observe the infant's biological sex, but assign it. And if you examine the literature produced by the GIDS, you will read this term assign sex constantly. Yeah. Secondly, the child can have an internal pre-social innate gender identity at odds with their sex body. And this internal perception of their true gender identity is the litmus test of whether the child is male or female and must be affirmed. And affirmation is the policy which, since 1989, the GIDS has taken and practices. And three, society systematically disadvantages and marginalizes transgender people and privileges cisgender people, a term again which the GIDS uses all the time. And cisgender people are those people who are allegedly comfortable with the gender belonging to the sex assigned to them at birth. So I'm coming to an end. The reversal of the established meanings of sex and gender is not just a human rights claim that a child is entitled to freedom of gender expression, which hopefully we would all endorse and support. It is an epistemological claim, and that is that an adolescent girl, such as Kira Bell, one of the people who brought the judicial review, who identifies as male, is not a female teenager who, for complex reasons, causes indeed, that need addressing, identifies as a boy. Rather, she is a boy and was born male. The psychotherapist with an alternative ethics of care is designated as transphobic, hateful, a bigot. So the idea of an innate transgender identity and that it is possible to have a female body but be male inside, and it is progressive to offer hormone therapy so that the child's body matches her inner sense of self, being male, has now rapidly established itself in the cultural psyche, despite the lack of any evidence for such a phenomenon. This belief now permeates multiple aspects of our culture beyond healthcare, the media, education, legislation, and so on. And this cultural context reproduces a catalogue of gender stereotypes that confirms to children and to some parents that they must be transgender, that medical reassignment of their sex body will resolve gender identity discomfort, and that without medical intervention, they will be likely to self-harm and probably commit suicide. And the Mermaids is one of those organizations that reproduces this narrative, and it's this narrative that children are ingesting constantly. So in conclusion, the GIDS sees itself as skewing a middle course between extremists. On the one hand, trans lobby groups which campaign for no gatekeeping whatsoever of the child's access to puberty blockers, And on the other hand, old-fashioned psychologists and who believe that trans identification has psychological causes rather than being a phenomenon that exists in and of itself. And these transphobic clinicians, or these retrograde or repressive clinicians, they would hurtfully deprive young people under 18 of the hormone blockers and cross-sex hormones, which would enable them to determine their own lives. So, but the fact is that the JIDS is not innocently operating middle ground caught in a vice grip of opposing and clashing political ideologies. It is true that there are two groups, those who affirm in a gender identity, and those, perhaps the many people in this conference who are also giving papers, who do not affirm in a gender identity. So the JIDS isn't innocently positioned between those because it takes a stand. It takes an affirmative stand. So it itself is hugely positioned in this narrative. Affirmation is an activist and not a clinical approach. So the National Health Service, JIDS, has co-created the very problem it is attempting to alleviate. The exponential growth in children affirmed in their self-identification as trans. For those of you who may be listening to this, who have understood the Tavistock as working within a conventional therapeutic context, you have been misled. The JIDS justifies supporting children to move towards treatment involving irreversible physical change according to a highly politicized account of sex and gender. The JIDS advocates a medical pathway that sterilizes physically healthy and phenotypically normal children and young people on the basis of a child's subjective feeling for which there is no scientific test, or when clinical diagnosis is based on the child's self-report, and it does so on the basis of an activist agenda of what constitutes social justice. Finally, the history of medicine is littered with egregious physical solutions to psychological, familial, sociological issues, hysterectomies, lobotomies, gay conversion, etc. I predict that we will look back at sterilizing girls and boys and wonder how society could ever have countenanced it at the beginning of the 21st century. Thank you.
So Julie, again, is probably somebody many of you will know. She's an investigative journalist, a feminist campaigner, and she's been a target of extreme transgender activists, she says, since 2004. So a long haul for her in terms of attacks from transgender activists. So it's with great pleasure that I can now invite Julie in to speak. Thank you, Julie.
In speaking about my personal experiences, many feminists and others that have joined this battle or been dragged into it in recent years will recognize themselves in it. So it's not a narcissistic exercise, do forgive me for personalizing it, but I do think it will resonate. And also I think that those who have any kind of public platform, who've been very publicly vilified, will recognize themselves, and those that don't have that public platform will perhaps see how it has served as a warning to them to not involve themselves, and especially for younger women who maybe certainly have a lot more to lose than do I, and others with established careers and a voice. And it's for those younger women and younger activists that I continue to do this work rather than try to bow out. And I think one important note in this, to do with this whole issue, is that apology and capitulation, once you have been labelled as transphobic, will never ever be effective. And I really do mean that. I think I made some comment on Twitter in a very dark moment recently, which was that those that are being told you should apologise, and it's never put politely like that. So this, I think, was towards Martina Navratilova, the tennis legend, who had said something incredibly reasonable about the inclusion of trans women in female sports. She had apologised for the tone of something she'd said, or how she'd made a comment rashly without thinking it through properly. And of course, she was harangued and hounded for that because she hadn't fully capitulated. And I think I said that I could set myself on fire, run through the town square, shouting, "Please forgive me, I repent, I apologise." And I would then be accused of causing the death of some passing trans person through smoke inhalation. So once we are targeted, they really do smell blood if you in any way capitulate or try to reverse your position. And that is, in fact, very different from saying, my tone was disrespectful. There was no need for me to make that joke. I should have thought more carefully before I made my argument in that particular way. That's fine. We should all do that on reflection, if we feel that that's something that we're responsible for. But certainly, this is about misogyny, and it's about men's rights activists being able to give feminists a good kicking, but still be seen as progressives. So I want to start, I think, from that very position, that the extreme trans activism, the extreme trans ideology, is a palatable way for liberals that hate feminists and excuse men to embrace men's rights and to justify having feminists hating feminists and still be seen as on the right side of history. And I know it sounds a bit harsh to suggest that some liberals hate feminists. Well, yes, because liberals aren't supposed to hate anyone. Liberals are supposed to just be the most reasonable. But that's not the case when we're talking about feminists like myself that campaign to end male violence, because, of course, many liberals are men, like all political movements and ideologies led by men, except for feminism, of course. And if you do feminism correctly, there will be a lot of men feeling uncomfortable, which is how it should be, reflecting on whether or not they are responsible or complicit in the abuse of women and acts of violence towards women. And so many liberals have always felt very uncomfortable about feminism. And the reason why I start off talking about liberals is I think that this is a big problem with how this capture has developed like a forest fire. Because, of course, if you have liberals on your side as feminists, which we did over those very visible men's rights activists, such as Families Need Fathers, or some of the later more strident groups that don superhero outfits and tie themselves to the tops of buildings demanding to see their children and refusing to accept that, that any woman is ever the subject of domestic violence. Those liberals did defend feminists when we said, look, we can't actually have these men's rights groups going to policymakers, lawmakers, and demanding rights for men to see their children when they've been abusive in the home. And liberals said, yes, that sounds perfectly reasonable to me. It's not acceptable. And they were on our side. Similarly, when we campaigned to end the double standard within the criminal justice system, where women were convicted of murder and imprisoned for life, despite the fact that they were in fact responding to sustained and horrific male violence in the home. The liberals supported us because it was not fair that this was happening. But if you're not a feminist, then you're not held to a feminist standard. So when the trans activists came along and started calling women like myself bigots and Nazis and the like, the Liberals were able to say, well, it does seem actually quite unfair what these feminists are saying. Why aren't they playing nicely? And they would then remind themselves, those of a certain age, that they marched alongside those of us that campaigned to end Section 28. And they saw, because they'd been told, and they hadn't scrutinised this issue properly, that, in fact, all that these nice trans people were demanding, yes, a little stridently and rudely, but who can blame them after what they've been through, was their rights and fair treatment, just like those of us who are lesbian and gay demanded our rights from the 1960s onwards. So because feminists had long been accused of being man-haters, of hating men, then the Liberals saw us as something unpalatable, because of course they don't hate anyone. So it's, well, this is actually making a little bit more sense. These feminists probably hate trans women because they see them as men, and they hate men, so therefore it all makes sense. And there you've got either a kind of, in the initial early days, a Mary Beard type response of, yes, they're transphobic, these feminists, and she said it specifically about me. Yes, I abhor Julie Bindel's transphobia, without scrutinising it at all, but she has the right to speak. So the Liberals only defended those of us who were being targeted on a free speech ticket, which I find deeply problematic and offensive, not being a blanket free speech advocate, and also not wanting to be labelled as transphobic by anyone, because I absolutely refute that. And I think that what started this investigation into the issue of transsexuality back in 2003 was my curiosity as a feminist who had been involved in the women's liberation movement since the very, very end of the 1970s, had focused on male violence and had recognised that sex stereotypes, what's now known as gender roles, were really harmful to women and positioned men as powerful in relation to women. So therefore, we were supposed to be the weaker sex and men dominated us. And this, of course, gave way to a normalisation of their abuse, of their control over us, and I would argue led to the normalisation and excusing of male violence. So as a very curious feminist, for those decades. In 2003, I remember seeing a really offensive article in one of the tabloids with the usual kind of headline, sex swap, man marries woman in freak ceremony. I mean, it was just dreadful. It was exactly like all of the coverage pretty much about transsexual people as they were known, much far more accurately, in my view, than transgender. These people had undergone sex change surgery and cross-sex hormones, and of course were viewed as freaks. And I wondered, why are psychiatrists still diagnosing men who decide that they are in the wrong body as suffering from some kind of mental disorder and condition, and offering surgery and cross-sex hormones as a solution? Because I'd first heard about this back in the 1980s when I was a feminist in women's organizations, where women were thinking about compulsory heterosexuality and the possibility of leaving deeply unhappy relationships and entering into relationships with women. And I heard of two men in the city of Leeds where I lived who had been left by women for other women and who themselves decided to become women through a sex change process and then identified as lesbians. And then all of a sudden, this newspaper story reminded me of this. And I thought, surely psychiatrists aren't still relying on this totally regressive, deeply offensive, essentialist notion of being trapped in the wrong body. So I set about doing a feature for the Sunday Telegraph magazine. And this was before these newspaper stories were routinely online, which is why I didn't get hell for that particular story. But it was in 2003 that I met Claudia. And I didn't go out looking for someone who had regretted going through sex change surgery. But I came across Claudia because a lawyer who I spoke to about this issue had represented Claudia when she had been sexually assaulted in an attempted rape by a man who assumed that she was female. And when Claudia reported this to the police just laughed at her and saw her as some circus freak. But what Claudia told me as I was interviewing her was that she'd always regretted the surgery and the hormones. And she had, in fact, been diagnosed in 45 minutes by a psychiatrist called Russell Reed, who many of you will know about. And if you don't, then do look him up, because he was severely reprimanded by the GMC in later years, in 2010, I think, when a number of trans people came forward and said that they'd been diagnosed by him, signed off for surgery, and had ever since regretted it. So that got me thinking about how, of course, all of this is based on sex stereotyping. And I decided to visit a store called Transformations, which was a chain at the time. I think there were 4 or 5 of these stores across the UK. And it was marketed very much for men who are cross-dressers, transvestite, who of course are now under the transgender umbrella. And I wrote after my visit in the Telegraph piece about the staggering array of merchandise, including pills that supposedly bring on feelings of premenstrual tension for transvestite men, for rubber stick-on vaginas so that these men can go to the loo and imagine themselves as real women, where, as the advertising made very clear, can turn your feminine fantasy into reality. And at that time, of course, there was no scrutiny in particular, but I started to piece things together, the basis on which transsexuality had been diagnosed. And by the time I wrote the piece that got me in serious trouble in 2004 in The Guardian, I was very angry about a trans woman called Kimberly Nixon, who had tied an invaluable service for women and girls up in litigation for 10 years, Vancouver Rape Relief, because they had decided against Kimberly Nixon, who had not been through any surgical or hormonal intervention, that it wasn't appropriate for Kimberly to give direct counselling to women who had gone to the service, who'd been raped and sexually assaulted. So at that time in Vancouver, the human rights lawyers had literally sat in wait for Vancouver Rape Relief to tell Kimberly Nixon that they couldn't, in fact, train to be a counsellor, and had immediately taken the organisation to court and almost had it closed down. So that was the beginning of it for me. And at the time, The Guardian was still taking pieces that were critical of the ideology, and that happened right up until about 2010. But what was going on at the time was the online community of trans women, because trans men weren't really involved at all. There were so few of them, and they weren't involved in the in this campaign to be recognised as actual women. They were starting to meet on listservs on something called Ginger Beer, which was a online lesbian community where women would look for friendship. They'd also look for sexual partners, for dates, and it appeared to be dominated by trans women, as did some listservs pre-Facebook. And so the organising had already begun. And when my article was published, there was a big lobby effort to complain to The Guardian. And in fact, it received 200 letters, some of which will have been genuine complaints and horrified at my assertions, but mainly were from a concerted lobby. And exactly at the same time, so around 2004, 2005, the National Union of Students, the NUS, had begun to be dominated by the kind of feminists that think anything that's bad for women and good for men is called feminism. So the fun feminists, for example, or the men that decided they were feminists and they could teach us feminists a thing or two. And so it was sex work is work, stripping is empowering, feminists are really old school. They decided that anyone over the age of 30 was completely irrelevant. And the NUS were very much lobbied by the trans activists following my article. And this in turn led to me being no-platformed by the NUS alongside 5 fascist groups. So I had the honour of being the first individual. And in fact, I think in one of the conference motions to decide on my continued no platforming just had the words Julie Bindel is vile. That's all they needed to say. And so it all happened along the time that feminism was being rebranded as something that actually really did benefit men, and moving it away from the real feminism that pointed out the human rights abuses that women face at the hands of men, and that this doesn't happen to us because of our biology, but that's often used as an excuse. 2007, I was asked by Radio 4 to do something, to take part in a series called Hecklers. And it was an interesting format. It was a person putting forward an unpopular or contentious view. For example, before me, they had someone who was speaking in favour of the Iraq War. And alongside the main speaker, there are 4 panellists that vehemently disagree from a variety of perspectives. And so it's 4 against 1. But not only that, the person, in this case me, that was speaking to the motion, sex change surgery is unnecessary mutilation, they could heckle at any time. So I get a couple of minutes here, a couple of minutes there, but they can heckle and try and shout me down. And it's a live audience. And actually, if you think that that sounds like a difficult format, just imagine, just think about how things are today, played out in real life, not on the radio. And it's about 100 times worse than that, isn't it? We try to speak and 100 people will heckle and shout. But anyway, this was a live event, and in the audience were mainly trans activists. I hadn't asked any of my friends and colleagues to come because I was so absolutely terrified of doing this that I thought that I'd make a show of myself. And the last thing I wanted was to catch anyone's eye in the audience that I knew. And afterwards, we had a drink together with the audience. It was very much encouraged, so all of the panellists. And I was very friendly with Stephen Whittle, still am in fact, who set up Press for Change, which was the very first transsexual rights organisation pushing for the legal and human rights of trans people. Stephen was one panellist, Peter Tatchell was another, Kevin Wiley, who is a clinician in a gender clinic, and a psychiatrist, do forgive me, a psychologist, Michelle, I'll remember the name later on. So we were all perfectly cordial afterwards, and my prevailing memory was, in fact, at that time, 2008, 3 or 4 trans men approaching me and lifting up their shirts and showing me their double mastectomy scars. Very proudly, very weirdly, not really the kind of thing to do at a post-Radio 4 live record during glasses of warm white wine. And a trans woman, Sarah Brown, who later became, or in fact might have even been at that time, a city councillor, a very influential person, in the trans movement, deeply misogynistic, wrote on their blog after the programme about me, saying that I seemed perfectly pleasant and, you know, quite a nice person, but said, despite her promises to be more considerate in future, Bindel seemed increasingly to be strident about trans people in the press. Now, there we have it. This was a how dare that bitch defy me. I hadn't become any more strident at all, but because of the attacks on me, I had to defend myself. I'd chosen to defend myself. And at that time, there was still a platform for me to do that. But it was like a collective, coercive control method that had come in. The bullying had reached fever pitch. And we were told, the few feminists, in fact, there weren't even few, there was no one, that I was told that if I didn't shut up, that I would be punished and I would be vilified. And from then, of course, it bled into Stonewall. And in 2008, I was nominated for Journalist of the Year at the Stonewall Awards. And this was not an internal to Stonewall shortlist. This was a general public shortlist. And that was when, as several trans activists have since documented in print, this was the beginning of the modern day UK-based trans rights movement, because 150 of them came down to the Stonewall Awards, which I would never have bothered going to. I didn't like Stonewall, had it not been for the protest. And ironically, in fact, I had to be walked through this baying mob into the Victoria and Albert Museum by Brian Paddock, who was then a police officer and who since has gone full trans Kool-Aid. I was down to win that award, and I was told by Diane Abbott, who was one of the judges afterwards, that the decision had been made. I had won. It was a clear win. I had, in fact, brought, I think, the words that Stonewall used when they were being phoned, emailed, harangued in general, was that I had brought lesbian issues to light in the mainstream media. But mythology would have it that the then chief exec of Stonewall, Ben Summerskill, stood firm and refused to denominate me. But this isn't true at all. He made a strategic decision to tell the judges that if they didn't, in fact, not allow me to win this award, that they would be in some serious trouble from which they might never recover. And the judges were, in the main, easily led into this, but felt uncomfortable about it because they'd seen the noise. They'd seen the fact that the press were day in, day out, fielding about 200 emails of complaint against me, and had caved in. And in fact, the prize was given to an agony aunt who wrote for the Daily Mirror called Miriam Stoppard, very nice woman, not a journalist and not a lesbian. So it was kind of obvious what had happened. And afterwards, the trans activists were going berserk that I'd even been nominated, despite being the only national journalist that wrote in the mainstream about issues to do with sexual identity and pride in being a lesbian. They said that, how dare Stonewall use the excuse that I was nominated for bringing the lesbian perspective to journalism. They ignored the fact that many of the protesters were trans lesbians. So here it had started, that we weren't even allowed to say that we were lesbians without giving significant ground to those that said that, in fact, any trans person, in other words, natal male, can identify as such. And another interesting thing that was happening at the time, which I think explains where we are today in part, was that Press for Change was being described almost in the way that feminists who campaigned against male violence were being described, which is irrelevant, old guard, old school. And so Stephen Whittle and Christine Burns, who were the spokespeople for Press for Change, were told by the younger transgender activists, which is by then the term had completely embedded, and replaced transsexual, and of course included all and sundry, including transvestites, as I said earlier. They were told that they shouldn't be calling for peace and unity, which Stephen Whittle did, and said, look, I disagree vehemently with Julie Bindel, but this is a discussion we need to have. And she makes some fair points, and she's got a long history in human rights defending of women. And they just completely dismissed that and said that this was capitulation to the transphobes. Now, when we move forward to today, I think it's really important to look at the fact that what has happened in the climate today is total fear. I think that we're wrong to describe this as a slow creeping capture, where organizations have absorbed this nonsense and have thought to themselves, this is fair, we agree that trans women are women, we agree that trans rights should trump everything else. I don't think it is that. It's a contagion. It's what happens when one of us is asked to speak, and then they have the kind of bullying and vitriol that wears a group or an organization down to the point of where it's no longer worth their while, and they do publicly deplatform that person, and they completely backtrack and apologize to the trans activists. And they're not persuaded by the ideology or this stupid narrative, but by fear. Then they can say, we deplatform Julie Bindel or whoever because we support trans rights, because they don't want this happening to them. And they justify their complicity and their cowardice. And this has also happened across the women's sector. The fear of losing funding, the fear of having to shield themselves from these bullies. And as one of the Booker Prize judges said to me recently, not realizing how offensive it sounded, that the reason why they took the decision that they did recently, and do you know what, I've even forgotten which decision it was, but it was some decision about somebody being denominated or deplatformed or denounced by the Booker Prize. This judge said to me, but we couldn't face coming into the office every morning to 200 hectoring emails. And I says, but why not? Why not? Yes, but the thing is that if we had not taken this stand, then it would have continued forever. Okay, well, there's our answer. The more we give in, the more we refuse to stand up for each other, the more we don't speak out because life is much easier to not speak out, the further this capture will creep and we will be done for. I think my time's up now. So thank you very much for listening, everyone.